Okay, I guess it's time to get started. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. My name is David Myers. I welcome you today to the second presentation to the Salt of the Earth School for Radical Education. The purpose of the school is to make people aware of how radical and working class organizations have served as a catalyst for positive change around the world. Our goal is to present a series of programs to that purpose. Before I turn the program over to today's facilitator, let me make a couple of announcements. First, please come back next Saturday at 3 o'clock, exact same setup. We'll have a timely and important presentation on the history of China during the era of the Communist Party, delivered by Dr. Ken Hammond from New Mexico State University, a leading scholar of Chinese history. And second, the Salt of the Earth School, that will be our last presentation for this year. We will be back, hope to continue next fall. We will continue next fall, and we hope to be able to present classes in person. And so please watch for announcements and check the webpage on a regular basis. And now I'll turn the program over to Lucy Norman, who is our facilitator for today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's class. Everyone knows that today we're talking about the UNM grad workers struggle to organize. And I'm just going to introduce everyone who's going to be speaking, because I was told that you guys can just kind of trade off who's speaking among yourselves. So we have Axel Gonzalez, who's a TA and a PhD candidate for American Studies, Joseph Bukakis, who's a GA and a PhD candidate of history, and Matthew Solis, a UE organizer, Ramona Melchinsky, a TA and a PhD student of geography, and Samantha Cooney, who is a PhD candidate, a TA, and a GA in political science. So if you guys want to get started, the stage is all yours.
All right, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here today. Can everyone hear me okay? All right.
We hear you fine.
Great. Okay, so I'm basically going to be speaking on a little bit of context for kind of the current state of university, especially when it comes to hiring practices, decision-making, compensation, and kind of put it in the context of neoliberalism, because this is more broadly applicable to like all workplaces, I think. It shapes neoliberalism kind of as this common sense of American society since, let's say, probably like the 70s. It shapes cultural attitudes around certain types of work that impact our ability to grow solidarity and mobilize disaffected workers. So we need to understand these cultural attitudes to advocate for ourselves as workers. And so that's something I'd like you to keep in mind going forward, is kind of how do people perceive the work that you do, and how does this kind of affect your sense of yourself as a worker? So just kind of a quick rundown of what neoliberalism is for the uninitiated. It's this cluster of ideas and practices that, like I said, make up this common sense that is ultimately one of the main things responsible for the hostility to unions in this country. So that's things like the free market as kind of an overarching logic, societies in service of the market, not vice versa, minimal government intervention, which I'm sure we all know is BS. And then there's the meritocracy, right? This idea that there's a level playing field, that everyone has the same chance, and that your self-worth is kind of steeped in what you're able to accomplish, which is usually quantifiable in terms of money. Slide, please. All right, so how has this affected universities specifically? So I think the first thing to go over, would be the nature of the college degree itself. It's a transactional relationship, right? There's no, in this kind of scheme of how universities work today, there's no real intrinsic value to learning, even though, some people might claim that there is in this schema. It's mostly just kind of career focused, right? You increase your human capital for paying for a degree, and I guess going and doing the work maybe a little bit, but just, secure those lines, get that money, get that scholarship, and you're going to get this degree, and it's going to make your life better. That's kind of what we're told when we enter college or encouraged to go to college. Then there's also the element of competition. So this gets into the meritocracy. So, as more and more PhDs are, coming out of universities and the job market is contracting for various reasons, especially for tenure track, everyone is encouraged to compete. And what this means is a lot of unpaid labor. Like most academic publications are unpaid, and all these different things to kind of put yourself ahead of the rest in a way that can lead to burnout, because it's something to constantly be worrying about. And then, like I said, just tons of unpaid labor. There's also this development of this teaching only class, which is lecturers or instructors. And this is part of what people are calling the casualization of academic labor. And so, how a tenure track professor is involved usually in some amount of research. They, will get sabbaticals in order to like have their teaching loads lightened or get time off of teaching in order to work on research. So as those jobs are shrinking, you have more and more PhDs going into this teaching only class. Um, they receive less consideration for tenure track jobs. This type of work is being devalued as care work or socially reproductive work. So you think about like the Association of Public School Teachers with Women for that reason. And then there is a gender disparity in this. So the majority of people in this class, according to what I've read, are women. And in 2016, the American Association of University Professors found that 73% of all faculty positions across universities are not tenure track. So a big reason for that is adjunct work. So as there are fewer and fewer tenure track jobs, universities are opting to hire adjuncts to teach classes. And so these are PhDs who take on contract semester by semester with no guarantee, often no guarantee, I don't know if that's universal, that those will be renewed. These people are having to move around a lot. Often there's no benefits. Often it's like between, I want to say 2,000 and 3,500 a class from what I've seen that they're just paid in this lump sum. So it's a very precarious position and it's very cheap for the university. Similarly, grad workers such as ourselves are increasingly taking on some of these intro level classes, often with minimal or no training or support from the department. It's just kind of like, here you go, it's professional training. Slide. And so, kind of zooming out to how universities are run, because I think this is really kind of getting at the heart of the issue. There's this tradition of shared governance in universities. This comes out in a variety of contexts, but the basic idea is that universities are democratically run because everyone participates in decision making. And so what this looks like, you might see at the department level, is a faculty rotating like department chair, director of graduate studies, with the idea that these managerial and administrative positions have limited terms, and the person serving those terms would go back to being faculty afterwards, presumably. So there's this kind of idea that there are no bosses, it's just us, the laborers are the bosses, when that's very obviously not true. I think there's a good example in my department. I've known a couple of people who've served, grad workers who have served on hiring committees in order to kind of give grad students a voice in who's coming into the department, because they're going to be our mentors. And in both cases, they told me that they felt like their opinions, which were dissenting, were not taken into consideration at all. So it was really just kind of a symbolic, like, look, we're including grad workers in this process. Shared governance also plays a role in anti-union rhetoric. So I'm going to read you a short passage from University of Washington union busting website that is really indicative of how this rhetoric works. So we UW faculty are independent entrepreneurs generating ideas, and we are accustomed to exerting a large degree of control over our working conditions. Unions have no experience with the kind of individual entrepreneurship involved in things like research grants. So you get that independent entrepreneur idea. That's a very neoliberal market-oriented way of describing what faculty do. So the rotation of department chairs, deans, and the like means that we are management, not just labor. The one-size-fits-all mode that unionization implies would hurt our ability to respond to competitive pressures for faculty, especially in high-demand disciplines. Unionization would cripple our ability in shared governance, right? So these ideas are juxtaposed against one another, whereas the union is all of the workers united. It's not this kind of random third party. It's kind of portrayed as this third party that it's just going to slow things down. It's just going to get in the way. It's going to undermine this tradition that universities are so proud of, even though it's obviously not working and the decision making is quite hierarchical. So you get into these issues of artificial scarcity and austerity politics. And this is kind of coming into focus, especially with COVID hitting in 2020. A bunch of university budgets got slashed. Overall, in the country, anybody working with a budget is having kind of deal with like new limitations with COVID. So there's a lot of uncertainty around organizing. I noticed with some of my peers when I was talking to them. And I have just a bit of a story to kind of put this in perspective. So in April 2020, so right after COVID hit, Johns Hopkins put out this new budget projection. I think it was for the next 15 months. And it predicted a shortfall of 475 million. And so the first thing they cut, as I understand it, was retirement contributions to faculty. And that would have accounted for like 100 million of the 475. The faculty thought it sounded a little suspicious, and so they hired an auditor. They put together a GoFundMe and got $5,000 together to hire an auditor. And they found that, among other things, there were $2 billion in reserves. Like there was no reason to delve into retirement funds. And so that was a flat out misrepresentation. You could probably call that a lie when it comes to the budget. That and the auditor just found that the shortfall wasn't as big as they had predicted. It was just misrepresentation of numbers. And so by that next February 2021, so the other month, Johns Hopkins announced that they were going to resume their retirement contributions and also pay retroactively to the beginning of the year. And so that's kind of the power of collective action there and demanding accountability on the part of the university. It's also very indicative of how decisions are made. And so there's also the issue of athletic spending. So doing some research on NCAA reports of recent years, I found that student athletes are not paid. That's unpaid labor. They might get tuition remission, but they're not, treated as workers, even though they're bringing in money for the university. On average, the amount of spending on student athlete tuition remission is roughly the same as coach compensation year to year. So like salaries for individuals, kind of a select number of individuals versus all student athletes tuition remission, like that's kind of putting things to scale. Athletic programs usually need subsidies from student fees and state funding, and they often run at a deficit. That and universities are not required to disclose how much tuition or student fees are being put towards athletics programs. Any revenue that comes from the high earning sports like football and basketball gets invested into the less successful sports programs, not into the university. That's typically how it works. And I believe that is just part of maintaining the university's brand, right? Like the sports usually make the brand for those bigger name like universities. And so this is, I often hear defense of athletics spending in the sense that it brings in revenue for the university, but that's obviously untrue. UNM's athletics program is guilty of embezzlement. It's undermined the state legislature's trust in us and confidence in giving our institution money. And the bigger picture is that, so there's basically no transparency when it comes to this. And, administration can say whatever they want when it comes to sports, but, they're not telling the truth. Slide. So kind of putting this context to work for grad students and workers. So the common issues that we face in the context of neoliberalism are, intra-departmental competition over funding. So this isn't uniform across campus, but there are lots of departments where semester by semester, you don't know if you're funded and you're competing with your peers and colleagues, like people in your cohort you're supposed to be bonding with. And that's just an extra stress semester by semester on top of everything else. We lack a voice despite that symbolic representation, decision-making, like I talked about with the grad students working on hiring committees. Stagnant pay, athletics and admins are continually getting raises. They all make 6, if not 7 figures, whereas ours largely stays the same. And then, there's the mental health issues and isolation that comes from this kind of culture of work. we're treated as individual entrepreneurs and constantly competing with one another and investing our work in like the grant money we can bring in, like fellowships. All of our worth is invested in that. So we have a good number of grad unions forming across the country, especially in the past, I want to say like 3 to 5 years. And so students are, grad students are recognition as public employees where they are allowed to, depending on what their state law is. And we've seen over since about like 2018, kind of a big strike wave. You know, you have the University of Illinois in 2018, Harvard in 2019. The UC system was causing all kinds of trouble in 2019 and 2020. And I think, yeah, to the present, it's really inspiring to see lots of sympathy strikes across that system. University of Michigan, Ann Arbor in 2020. I'm sure a lot of you are aware of the Columbia strike. Right now it's on pause. And then there are undergrads, I believe, still on strike at Kenyon University. And that was a month or two ago that started up. And so our current situation in our legal battle with UNM is that they're trying to say that we are not workers, effectively undermining any like claim that we have the right to bargain under the Public Employee Bargaining Act at UNM. And so I think that really speaks to these cultural attitudes around academia and the work that we do as, you know, grad workers and the value we contribute to the university. So the bottom line is essentially that, you know, academia and universities as institutions are at a crossroads. Right now, things are looking pretty bleak, especially with the job market, with, you know, how hard it is to survive on stipends. So we really have nothing to lose by going all in on a union. And ironically, that's been a big source of optimism, at least for me, you know, big source of inspiration. And these implications for unionizing at the university level go beyond compensation and benefits, right? Support for underrepresented or marginalized grad students, these capitalistic attitudes that enforce unhealthy ideas about work and education, those hiring practices, and then, you know, the transparency when it comes to decision making that I was talking about. So yeah, I mean, that's a bit of context to kind of set up what the rest of my comrades are going to be talking about. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Joe. So a lot of the system structures that Joe was talking about led to the conditions that us graduate workers at UNM were facing. Personally, I joined in grad school about 4 years ago now, almost 4 years ago, and I immediately was overworked. I immediately felt completely drained of all energy because of how difficult my classes were on top of all of the work that was expected of me. I wasn't able to afford basic necessities. At that time, I thought that perhaps I would be given enough to live on, and so I didn't seek out a second job right away, or have that, you know, funding behind me to back me up. And so on top of all of this, on top of all these horrible working conditions, there was also just rampant problems of racism and sexism and harassment that existed within academia. And I was seeing a lot of that personally, and I saw a lot of my colleagues be hit with that personally. And so this just kind of, it wasn't like this everywhere though. When I would go for conferences later, not necessarily my first year, because I still didn't realize that this wasn't the norm, or it shouldn't be the norm. But later on in my academic career, I started realizing that other grad students who are unionized didn't actually have these horrible working conditions, or not nearly to the point that me and my colleagues were facing. And so I sort of got to this point later on in my career that I realized that we shouldn't have to be doing this. This is not right. And so that kind of idea just kind of was in the background as a spark for me and some of my colleagues. And when COVID hit, that's when things got really bad. I was already expected to be on call like 24/7. I had an advisor who was emailing me at like 2 a.m. expecting me to get work done before class in the morning, that sort of thing. But then when COVID hit, it became really bad. And I saw colleagues of mine be sent into classrooms that the professors deemed unsafe for their own health. And they're like, well, you guys are grad workers, you can go and deliver the tests for me instead. And not taking into mind that we as individuals can have health issues as well. And just because we might possibly be younger than the professors, that shouldn't be a reason to send us into hazardous places of work. So then, so on top of COVID, I was expected, or those unsafe conditions, I was expected to TA for, of course, my professors, and set all of their classes up online, and do a lot of work online as well. My colleagues were expected to do this as well. And on top of this, I was prepping for my comprehensive exams, and nothing was really done to give me more resources with that. And so, but anyway, we hit kind of this point when COVID started, and a lot of my colleagues have been working towards unionizing for years. And a lot of them were working towards a union knowing that they wouldn't reap the benefits. And they knew that they were going to graduate without seeing where their work would come into fruition. I think, can you hit the arrow a couple times? So when, so when COVID hit, we got this point where we knew that our working conditions were absolutely atrocious and we needed to do something. So me and a couple of my friends started this petition. And all we wanted was some funding extensions. We just wanted some of the same resources that were being given to undergrads. Because while the university was giving, pass and fail options to undergrads, or credit, no credit, graduate workers were not really given any resources to fall back on. So we started this petition and we did not get a good response. Basically, we were told to beg our departments for money. And we all know how that goes. Their departments are going to say no, of course, and our departments did. Recently, we did a survey, and I think the total amount people got in funding was like $80, and that was like 14% of us got like $80. Anyway, so the petition got kind of the ball rolling. Over the summer, we began strategizing really hard. And this is the point where unionizing is a lot of calling your fellow colleagues. It's a lot of talking to your fellow workers. And we were sending tons of emails and just talking to each other and strategizing sort of underground and having these meetings. And so that's when it got to a point where we started recruiting more and more people for our organizing committee. And so we would reach out to our friends in our departments and ask them if they knew people who would be on board with unionizing. And so we had these strategies in organizing and talking to our colleagues. And this is when UE was extremely helpful in providing those conversations for us and saying, this is what you should hit on. This is how you should talk to your fellow workers, and gave us a lot of really great advice going forward. We started our card drive in September, very early September. That's when we decided to start giving those union cards that you see, that you sign on to our colleagues. At first, they were physical cards, and so that was really difficult during a pandemic. And so we would kind of like socially distance, drop them off and have people sign and then drop them off again. But then we got electronic cards. And so we started emailing, forwarding those. and strategizing as to like what our union would look like in the future. And so it's really interesting because on this slide here, it says, what will our organization look like in the future? And now our organization actually does look like this. This was months and months ago. And so we decided to announce publicly our card drive in October, very early October. That's when we started hitting the ground running, emailing, calling, having these office hours where we would talk to people. And so then we hit a supermajority in December 9th. That's when we hit supermajority, we have over 1,000 union members now. And so working and with each other and talking to each other and getting the ball rolling and connecting with each other, like that really does work. And so we hit supermajority in December, but then we heard back from UNM in January, and they filed a petition against our union, and they cited a proposed Trump administration ruling that said that private university grad workers are not employees. We're not a private university, so it shouldn't have even been cited. But UNM is that against our union that they were willing to put a proposed ruling like that on their petition against our union. And so they said that we're not public employees. And they also said that we don't have a community of interest. So even though we work together and prepare classes and talk to each other and our colleagues, we do not share a community of interest, which is of course untrue. So we hit back. We had a big protest in January, on January 27th. We had a car rally. It was very well attended, and it actually had national attention from DSA and the Sunrise Movement nationally. We have a lot of people on our side, and this really helped us with motivation and energy. And so this protest was meant a lot to us, and we feel like it hit back at UNM and showed UNM just how strong our union is. And so currently now we are in the middle of a labor board hearing. UNM is still stalling, asking to stall, continually putting arguments out there that we're not employees, that we do not share community of interest. And so we have been fighting them legally, of course. But the good news is, and no matter what the New Mexico Labor Board decides, we still have a union. That's a good thing about our union efforts, is we already have a union. We're here to stay. And no matter what the New Mexico Labor Board decides, we're not going anywhere. They would be the only state, though, to decide we're not public employees. That would be very rare. So we are confident going forward, but that's our, I guess, a general overview of our struggle to get here and our fight. And I'll hand it over to Matt to talk more about UE.
Cool. Hi, everybody. My name is Matt. I'm an organizer with UE. Again, I'm here to just kind of talk a little bit about how I got involved with UE, how I got involved with the UNM struggle, and how the struggle that they're waging right now relates to the struggle of all workers in the United States, and how the organizing work of all workers is connected. So I got involved with UE through unionizing drive at a coffee shop that I worked at. It was called Augie's. It was in Southern California. Yeah, maybe give me a couple slides. Yeah, it was in Southern California. It was a small, medium-sized chain of coffee shops, probably 6 different shops in the Inland Empire. Yeah, and the drive kind of started out with some shady staffing practices during the pandemic. The employers were essentially using the pandemic as an excuse to purge employees that they didn't like personally or for other silly reasons. from the roles, while other employees were having to work 10, 12, 15 days in a row with no overtime, and really no support from management at all, which was brutal for a lot of people, especially, we had a lot of young parents, people with families who were shouldering those shifts. When workers began to push back on that stuff, management would threaten shop closures and be like, well, if you guys can't staff, maybe this shop's not going to make it, that kind of stuff, which was disgusting and really brutal. So we started talking about organizing around those issues. Pretty quickly, we got about 80% of people, 80% of the staff signed under cards. Took us about a month. And with the help of UE, we launched our union drive. We were organizing mostly around kind of the meat and potatoes issues that service workers face, things like paid time off, which doesn't really exist in that industry, wage theft, stagnant wages, which were minimum across the board. No matter how long you worked at the shop, you could be there for 10 years and still make minimum. And a working grievance procedure. The drive was intense, very short. It only lasted about 3 months, but very difficult. Pretty much everyone who works in the service industry lives paycheck to paycheck, like a lot of my colleagues at UNM, right? We're all pretty much in a very precarious position where if our checks are cut, we're looking for food. So the fear of like reprisal and retaliation for management was incredibly real. During the drive, we experienced some pretty intense intimidation and harassment from management, especially long-term employees that have been with the company a long time. We're getting called into one-on-one meetings and harassed, asked for loyalty, asked them that they would pledge to the boss that they wouldn't join the union. People even being fake fired, right? Workers being told that they were fired. And then management would never action it, right? They would just try to intimidate workers in that way. It was really difficult, but we stuck tight and we demanded recognition. It all kind of culminated in this town hall meeting our boss tried to hold, where he wanted to have everyone get together in a big group of 40 or 50 people, and we could have a dialogue about how we could improve the company. We showed up and stayed organized. Everyone wore their buttons and everyone demanded a union, right? So we had the whole staff demand a union, which was cool. It was cool. After that, we were kind of promised again and again that we would have time to meet with management and talk. They would promise a meeting, and then an hour before, yank the meeting. They would do stuff like that all the time. So we couldn't get a meeting with management. And then the one day of the year that the shops were closed, which is 4th of July, right? Every shop's closed on 4th of July every year. They sent out an email to everyone who worked at the shop saying all the shops are closed indefinitely and you're all fired, right? So they fired every worker, every pro-union worker at Augie's, and they kept on non-union staff to work the warehouse and keep selling coffee out of the warehouse. Yeah, super lame. It was super lame. It was really shocking to kind of hear that. It hurt really bad, to be honest with you. I felt a ton of responsibility for leading a drive that resulted in some people maybe losing their jobs, but we stuck tight and we kept fighting. I was convinced that what Augie's was doing was illegal. We filed an unfair labor practice charge with the NLRB, and we said, we're going to get our jobs back. We're going to have our union. We're going to have justice. So we kept at it. We confronted Augie's. This picture here is from like a rally that we had where we confronted them. They were passing out last paychecks, and 150 people from the community showed up to let Augie's know how we felt, let them know what was going to happen, that we were going to have our jobs back. They tried to open a wine store in the community, right? Take all their money that they had saved up over the pandemic. They got a bunch of PPP money from the government, right? And they were going to move it into a wine store so they could kind of ditch us all, right? And keep making money. We were able to block that, like through the City Planning Commission, which also was sick. One thing I did learn throughout that process is the NLRB process was not really designed to workers. At every kind of turn, there was a chance for Augie's to dodge responsibility, and it turns out that they were allowed to close all the stores really with no repercussions. The NLRB did eventually rule in our favor, stating that what Augie's did was illegal, but they have no power to impose any penalties or force them to reopen or do anything really. They said that they would send us a letter saying that we had been wrong, and that was the extent of what would happen if we won the case, right? So we ended up settling out of court for a really small amount of money, which was a bummer. It's not all bad news though. We, formed such a tight bond like through this process that we like are transitioning the shop into a worker co-op, right? So we crowdfunded a bunch of money. We've been selling coffee online for the past year or so, and we actually just signed a lease on a building in our city to open a cafe. So this is Slow Bloom Coffee. This is what we're doing now. And yeah, I mean, it's just built out of the same expression that led the union drive, that workers deserve control over their lives, and that they should be able to dictate how the places that they work are run, because they do the work, right? And it should be theirs in a very explicit sense. So Slow Bloom is ours, right? Yeah, I mean, through this process, I got involved with UE right after the drive. I started work, or a couple months after our drive, I started working with UE. They invited me to come help out on the UNM campaign. At first, it was very difficult for me to see how I could help, not having a ton of experience in academia, really only having been a restaurant worker for my entire life. But I soon figured out that the struggle that we were engaged in at Augie's was parallel to the same, was the same that the graduate workers at UNM are going through right now, in a lot of ways. Yeah, so through participating in this drive, yeah, I just realized that union drives across industries are fights for working people to have a say-so in their everyday life, right? On the most basic level, right? Like the types of the things that we would bargain for in a contract would be very different, but the basic premise is that we should be able to decide how our day-to-day lives look, how our workplaces look, and how we're compensated by our employers. Even though, yeah, sorry, I lost here. Yeah, and I began to see UNM, right, which is supposed to be a public institution that operates for the good of everybody, right? We pay taxes to this place so they can do a service that we want, right? The behavior of UNM mirrored my boss's behavior, with UNM constantly dodging responsibility, constantly publicly saying that they support the union and they support and care about the grad workers, while behind the scenes, constantly undercutting their ability to input, constantly blocking them from being at the table where decisions are made. That was exactly what we experienced in the Augie's drive as well. Yeah, and the last parallel that I saw through both drives was that if stuff like this is really going to get done, if rank and file labor action is really going to take hold in a workplace where, in a true sense, the workers are making decisions about where they work, it's going to be because there are some people who are willing to make building worker power an important part of their everyday life, right? There's, you need people who have decided that this is worthwhile, just like a career or just like any other life goal would be, right? That building some control over your own life is something that's worth doing every day, right? And like you like the people, I've seen so many incredible organizers through the UTW campaign who kind of live and breathe that every day. So I've been super inspired by them. So thank you, and I'm going to pass it to Axel now, correct?
Hey everyone, can you hear me good? Cool. Yeah, it's really great to be here and be chatting with all of you. Thanks to everyone putting together the event that invited us. It's also really good to just kind of step out of the trenches for a second. Like as Samantha was saying earlier, a lot of organizing is just making a lot of phone calls, meeting with our colleagues, having one-on-one conversations. This is the kind of nuts and bolts of organizing. And it feels like, we've just been doing that for like a year, and like we've been in the trenches. And it's nice to hear from Samantha and Joe and Matt and Ramona, who's going to talk later about how kind of you all have experienced all of this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of how unions can be a kind of broader, a space or a vehicle for a kind of broader social change, right? And how unions can actually not just do the work of, winning us better wages and better working conditions at work, but also kind of unions can be the vehicle through which we build another world, right? and how UE in particular as a union that's committed to kind of democratic rank and file struggle, right, and to aggressive struggle on behalf of the entire working class, not just the kind of bread and butter issues that we fight for in a contract, right? But how UE is a union that's committed to that, and it's been committed to that from its very beginning, kind of gives us the space to be able to do that. So really, I wanted to just, I don't want to spend too much time because I do want to get to questions and kind of hear what folks want to talk about. But I want to give kind of one example of another kind of UE-like union in Australia, who's not around anymore. UE, unlike some of the other left unions in the US, did kind of survive the assault on left unionism. And made it to today. This one didn't, but I think I want to share a story from them that I think is helpful for kind of this mode of unionism that I'm talking about, right? Can we go back to the previous slide, actually? Sorry. Yeah. So the picture on the left here is from the New South Wales Building Labourers Federation. This was a left labor union in Australia and Sydney, that was kind of at its height in the early 70s. And they're famous for what was known as the Green Bands. I'm going to explain what that is in a second. But essentially, right, this is a union that took part in aggressive struggle for their members. From the period between 1971 and 1974, they engaged in over 50 strikes, right? And just a period of 3 years. That's a ton. And made lots of wins during these years, right? They won much better, wages for themselves. They won much better protections at work. Building workers are participating in some of the most dangerous labor that we know of. They're very successful at making big wins for their members, right? But as the union kind of really took shape and kind of embraced its identity as a rank and file democratic union, they started to also turn their attention to the community, right? And to kind of what was going on in the community, right? These were workers that were literally building the world, right? They were building the buildings in which we lived in. And that they've realized that the project of building the world was not a kind of innocent, apolitical one, right? So as kind of Sydney was developing at the time, and skyscrapers were starting to be built, and people were being pushed out of working class neighborhoods, right, and out of affordable housing, right? The union took issue with this, right? And they started, and when kind of these developers were coming in, and these developers were basically asking workers to demolish working class housing projects, to demolish parkland, to log entire forests for the building of wealthy luxury townhomes and other kinds of buildings, right? They started going on strike to protest against those, right? And these are what were called the Green Bands. And the way it would work is the community that was already organizing against this, right, through petitions and all that stuff that were being ignored, right? No one was paying attention to a petition signed by community members whose houses were about to get demolished. But when the community called for a ban on these building projects, the union, they recognized it, and they what's the word I'm looking for? They recognized the ban, and they started to strike the developers, right? So they would strike the developers when the community would call for a ban. And they won over and over and over again, right? The Green Bands were incredibly successful. The union stopped countless demolition projects, right? You can see the photo here on the right that says moratorium. for Black rights. This was in response to a planned demolition of homes in a community of mostly Aboriginal residents, right? And the union had many Aboriginal members, right? The union struck the developers, right? And then the city, which had just elected a kind of liberal central government, centrist government, actually then bought the land from the developers and returned it to the community after the strike. This was one of the kind of first instances of kind of land back and land being returned to Aboriginal folks in Australia. And it happened because of the strike of these workers. Yeah, and the union took part in lots of other social justice issues, right? They forced their employers to hire women and to hire them at equal wages, right? In an industry that was dominated by men, right? The union banned the university building project until the university agreed to hire women's studies instructors, right? So they took part in a struggle that was much more than about them. That started with them, right? And started with aggressive struggle to improve their wages and working conditions, but made it about something much, much bigger, right? Yeah, you could go to the next slide here. I'm gonna wrap up because I don't want to take too much time. I want to get to questions. But really, yeah, I mean, I think they give us an example of again, a kind of unionism that's about building something bigger, right? That's about building another world. Right, something that UE has been doing since its beginning, right? Yeah, the picture here on the right is from a strike in 1952 of the Farm Equipment Workers Union, which was affiliated with UE in the 50s. And yeah, the FE, as they were called, really engaged in this, you know, radical militant unionism to at a time where unions were kind of following the same segregationist rules of the rest of the country, and particularly the rest of the South. They were organizing with Black and white workers and organizing against segregation in their community. Again, I want to wrap up here, and you go to the final slide. I want to wrap up here with this quote from Jack Mundy, who was a leader of the New South Wales Building Laborers Federation. And he says here, yes, we want to build. However, we prefer to build urgently required hospitals, schools, other public utilities, high quality flats, units, and houses, provided they're designed with adequate concern for the environment, than to build ugly, unimaginative, architecturally bankrupt blocks of concrete and glass offices. Though we want all our members employed, we will not just become robots directed by the developer builders who value the dollar at the expense of the environment. More and more, we're going to determine which buildings we build. The environmental interests of 3 million people are at stake and cannot be left to developers and building employers whose main concern is making profit. Progressive unions like ours, therefore, have a very useful social role to play in the citizens' interests, and we intend to play it. So again, right, these are the workers who are building the world, and they said, we're not going to build a world in which, you know, our working class brothers and sisters are being pushed out of their neighborhoods, right? We're not going to build a world that's toxic, that where our members themselves could barely breathe, right? This is a kind of unionism, again, that UE is committed to, and that we're committed to here, right? We're doing the work here of researching and teaching, you know, the kind of teaching the people, right? And imagine if we came together and said, you know, we're only going to do research that betters the people, that's for the people. We're only going to teach, right, material, right, that benefits the people, right? And that's what's really strong about us coming together as a union right now, is that we could come together to do that. I'm gonna, go ahead and pass it over to Ramona.
Okay, thanks everyone. So I'm just quickly going to talk about why I joined the union and why I'm in higher education. So my parents always told me that going to university was crucial for securing financial security, job opportunities. I think a lot of families say that to children who they hope can have a better future than they had. And for both of my parents, they were first generation college students, and it really changed the course of our family. So ever since I was little, I wanted to be a scientist or a researcher and go to university. I wanted to study environmental science to solve like these big problems like climate change or hunger or inequity. And I aimed to go to the best university that I could get into, which happened to be Stanford, to the surprise of many of us in my family. So I went to Stanford thinking like, yeah, if you go to university, you can solve the problems of the world. And I think a lot of students go to college thinking that, or maybe they go to college thinking I'll be able to get a better job after I get a college degree. Um, so I got to Stanford and it was a lot different than I thought. I didn't really have any attention from my professors, like no one-on-one interactions. The professors didn't seem engaged in teaching. The people who really got me through university were the graduate students, the TAs, the GAs, the program assistants who were acting as my advisors, were teaching me all the course material outside of class, tutoring me, helping me get through organic chemistry, calculus, history papers, things like that. And I was just really surprised at like the way that universities actually function versus what I thought they were like. And I think based on what Joe said, it had a lot to do with professors feeling competition to publish, to not teach very much, but to get their name out there through publications, get grants, get paid for research. So a lot of the actual work with undergrads fell on the graduate students. And I also felt like in university, there was no discussion of the actual reason why we have problems like inequity or climate change or hunger, when we have enough resources in the whole world to provide enough for everyone to have a house, eat, have water, go to school for free. So at university, I was kind of like, oh, I'm in my fourth year and I don't feel like I really learned what I wanted to, or like I don't feel like I have a direction of how to change things for the better in a way that I want to. And I felt like my university was very removed from working class people's reality, from my own lived experience, where the solutions were always, hey, like aim to be the CEO of a nonprofit, aim to be the sustainability consultant for Chevron, aim to build your own startup. But like that wasn't accessible to me and most of the students who were working class at Stanford with me. And it also just didn't seem appealing. It was very much about self-promotion, and in a way that to me didn't seem like it was actually building community power or working class power, even though I didn't know how to explain it at that time. But I wanted to keep going. I actually wanted to be a professor because I was hoping that I could be a professor who was a good teacher and mentor to undergrads that I didn't get. So I kept going, and I asked my friends, like who are already in PhDs, what's it like to be a PhD student? And they said, it's awful. Like you don't get paid anything. Your advisor can treat you really badly, and there's no protections or any way to avoid that. You don't know if you're ever going to get a job afterward. And they were telling me like, don't do it. If I could redo it, I wouldn't come to grad school, but I'm already 3 years in, so I'm just going to finish, which was really discouraging. And I decided to do it anyway. I decided to go to UNM because it's where I'm from. I'm from Albuquerque. I had my family to rely on. It's the cost of living is better here in Albuquerque. So I thought, I can make it on a grad worker stipend. And so far, I'm really lucky because my department actually does treat me very well compared to like some of the experiences that we've heard here. But I know that that could change in any minute because I don't have any protections. There's no formal, my contract doesn't say how much work I do or what my responsibilities are. It just says 20 hours a week. The healthcare doesn't cover a lot of my healthcare costs, whereas when I was on Medicaid, I had full coverage. Like I know that I probably wouldn't have decided to go to graduate school unless I had financial assistance from my family who helps me make car payments, or if I have a health expense, like an emergency health expense, I know I can fall back on my parents. And I know that there's a lot of graduate students who can't do that. And I think every day that I'm very lucky to be able to be a graduate student. So basically, I joined the union because I think that we all have a right to a living wage, healthcare, and I think that we need to make universities a better place for minority students or working class students who might be thinking, I can't afford to go to graduate school. And if that's the case, nothing is ever going to change. And we're going to have, the same type of people, the same ideas in graduate school, and not have, new and different perspectives, or working class people who get to become professors and teach their experience or teach about working class power. And I feel like a union brings that class consciousness that I lacked in my undergrad. That brings that directly to the forefront of the conversation on campus. Like right now, hundreds of undergrads are hearing about our union struggle. They're hearing about how employers treat employees, how UNM treats grad workers, what it means to be a worker, and the right to unionize, and what our labor power can do for us. So I think bringing unions into academia can radically transform universities to be more class conscious, and unite us to help build working class power, connect us to other working class communities, and help us realize that all of us are workers. Undergrads, grads, professors, we're all workers, and we should all be working for working class power. So yeah, that's it.
Are there any other speakers? No? Okay. That was a very powerful presentation by all of you. Thank you very much for that. So now it comes to like the Q&A part of it. So if anyone has a question, go ahead and type it in the chat. And if there's like a person who wants to read it specifically and answer it, just go for it. Otherwise, I can just read the question out and kind of let someone pick it. We'll just, if you have a question, just put it in the chat. We'll figure it out. Okay, so why is there no coverage of the struggle and the university's resistance is so ludicrous? So who wants to take that one?
I can go ahead and take it if you guys are cool with that. So yeah, there has been a lack of coverage locally. We have actually experienced more press coverage on like a larger national level than we have just in Albuquerque. We have submitted a bunch of opinion like op-eds and a letter to the editors to local newspapers. We release like press releases each time we have an event to local papers, and we have been struggling to get our efforts covered by the Albuquerque Journal and other local papers. We think this is of course due to the fact that they don't want to be on a bad side with UNM, and obviously like Albuquerque is a very I guess closed off community where everyone kind of knows someone who works at UNM or is connected to UNM. And so the local papers have been very resistant to not only cover our story themselves, but also even publish our op-eds. The Daily Lobo is really the only news source that has been kind of like on our side. Going forward, they're always there publishing our stuff and covering our struggle. Nationally, we did have a piece in The Guardian that mentioned us. We did also have a magazine cover us, which is like a union labor-based magazine called In These Times. So we have had a bit of coverage nationally, but locally it's been tough.
Yeah, and I'll also say we're not getting the same sort of union busting from the university that the faculty got just a year before us. Because I remember when the faculty were unionizing, seeing emails come out being like, UNM administration isn't encouraging you to vote any which way, but you should have all the facts. And they're not really, I've never seen them do that with us. They're just doing this sneaky little legal maneuver, which is the petition. And I think that speaks to how UNM itself just doesn't want this out there. And they're not willing to give us that airtime by publicly opposing us. And so, frankly, I find it really insulting. They think they can just kind of sneak that legal maneuver in there. But that would be, yeah, the lack of coverage also on that line.
Yeah, I think also the faculty unfortunately had some anti-union faculty members. And so grad workers have been lucky in that we have a super majority on our side and don't have that sort of movement within our workers that unfortunately the faculty had to deal with. And UNM, of course, like kind of sparked that.
All right, thank you for that answer. Does anyone else have a question? If so, you can feel free to unmute your mic and ask it or put it in the chat.
I have a question, but I'm like part of UGW, so I want to let other people if they have questions.
I would say go for it.
Yeah, I have a question like about, I think that, I mean, myself and in the wider community, there's a perception oftentimes of like being in graduate school and stuff, it's something of a privileged position, and I wonder how you all think about this in terms of what it means to organize a union and from that type of like positionality and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Erin. Because yeah, I do think that I have, privilege in a lot of ways, like I was saying, that I feel like if I didn't have some financial backing from my parents, that I probably wouldn't take the risk of going to grad school. But I know that it's also maybe the field I'm in, because I think some people maybe going to grad school for them, it kind of does possibly guarantee employment, like law school or MBA or something like that. But I also think that just fundamentally, it's good to know that that we're still workers. We don't own the means of production. We're not business owners. We don't create the profit, like we don't benefit from profits ourselves, but we're the ones creating the profit. So we're still in that worker position. But I think that's a good question, because I think before the union started, some of my friends who are not in graduate school didn't understand why we would be unionizing, or if we were workers, kind of like what Joe was saying. Like, a lot of people think that graduate workers aren't workers, or they don't understand what they do for the university, which is basically the same thing as a professor or an adjunct or a lecturer, who are considered employees. But I guess what my point is, I think that the union brings that consciousness that we are workers, whereas before people wouldn't think that, and they wouldn't know how hard it is to be a graduate worker. I don't know if someone else wants to add to that, or if that kind of answered what you thought, Aaron.
I will add real quickly that having been completely unfamiliar with like what the landscape was for graduate workers in the US, I was really shocked, like for the first couple months of the campaign, to see how bad the conditions were, how low the pay was specifically. And that was really shocking to me as someone who had come from food service organizing, because the thing that we always heard was like anyone could do your job, and like people are kind of right when they say that, but like you guys are, what was so shocking to me was like how much time and like effort you guys have had to put into like developing yourself as academics. Like you really are experts in what you do. And like, yeah, it's crazy to see people assert that people who know as much as you guys do and have put as much time and effort into your craft like don't deserve like fair and adequate representation.
Yeah, I think some of it, and I'm curious what other people think too, but I think some of it also comes with like the kind of ivory tower effect, right? And there's a loss of like community integration and learning even that happens. I mean, at UNM, there used to be the research service learning project, and there used to be somewhat more initiatives that they were difficult to establish, and they didn't always weren't always able to be maintained with much administrative support, that really tried to bridge learning and research into the community in a more grassroots type of way. But so I do think that's part of the problem too.
Yeah, actually, I think a lot of that disconnect between the community and academia that has led to this whole ivory tower issue kind of comes from grad worker pay also. I mean, if you think about who as grad workers have the ability to depend on other funds outside of just their work, they're wealthy people. They're people with families who have that money for them that set aside. These are people who have that place to fall back on. And most of them historically have been white. Most of them historically have been rich. And so this whole disconnect that has occurred throughout academia is because we do not pay our workers enough to get by on their own just by their income. And so this is, it's a huge problem. And UNM, who claims to be this Hispanic serving institution and who cares about diversity, is not paying their graduate workers and therefore continuing this cycle of systemic racism, because that's what it is. And it excludes people of color and those who are not of means. And so, it creates this disconnect, I think.
Lucy, I got a question. If I
Oh,
could.
awesome. Go for it.
Okay, actually, it's a three-part question. I'm curious about a few things. One, I'm curious about what kind of support there is from the faculty, especially those that were involved in the last union campaign for the faculty. And second, are the undergraduates aware of this and are they supportive? And are any of the other unions on campus supportive of your actions?
I can start here. So I guess speaking to the faculty union and the other unions on campus, we've been in conversation with every union on campus. And every union on campus has, kind of endorsed us, signed on to a letter of support, calling on UNM to do the right thing and recognize the union and start bargaining with us. We actually have a rally on Monday, which every union on campus is going to speak at. And hopefully this is also kind of kickstarting more kind of connection between the different unions on campus and different workers. Because up to this point, we've been kind of isolated, but right now there's a really strong connection and hopefully we could keep building that. You had another question. That I forget now.
I was curious about undergraduate students.
Undergraduate students. Anyone else want to talk about that? I got a teaching plan, which is.
Yeah, I can.
Cool.
I mean, okay. So we have a lot of undergraduate support, which has been really energizing for us. We have had undergrads show up to our car rally and our protest and show their support publicly online and in our classrooms as well, our digital classrooms. And we have had undergrads also tell us that they are interested in attending grad school at UNM now that there's a union and they know that it is more beneficial to be a grad worker with a union, of course. And so the undergrads have been really supportive and it's been really great to have them on our our side. We have a teach-in planned next week during our week of action. And so we'll be, all of the TAs and the union and instructors of record are going to be teaching the undergrads that they have in class about the union and the labor movement and how UNM has fit into that that broader movement on a national level. So we will be having a public teach-in and showing everyone what's going on I think, I'm sorry, it's Tuesday, right? I think so. So we'll be having a public teach-in on Tuesday, and you can see exactly what we're telling our undergrads and teaching them during the classroom time as well.
Okay, great. Thanks. Great. This has been a great program. This is really great. Thanks.
I will say really quickly that we're seeing so much solidarity from across the country in terms of other grad unions. So kind of regardless of where we are when it comes to like other unions on campus, the faculty union, this is really telling me, and like with the strike wave I was talking about, and unionization wave, this current generation of scholars is going to be a union generation. Like we're going to be the ones filling these ranks. And so that has me, that's given me more hope than anything. It's just kind of like how we're networking with other grad workers across the country, attending each other's meetings, signing each other's petitions. So.
And then we have a question, what about unionizing student athletes, from Aaron?
Do you think it's possible? I mean, you guys mentioned like, you know, non-paid labor and all this, right? And I mean, it'd be a culture shift for sure, but I mean, is there inroads that could be made there? Or, I mean, is it worth like pursuing? I don't know.
I don't know. I think, I mean, like the undergrads at Kenyon University are organizing. They're on strike. They were on strike earlier. I'm not sure if they're still on strike. But I mean, undergrad workers also, yeah, face these same issues, and of course, yeah, student athletes do as well. They're extremely exploited and have no means to accrue funds on their own, really. Because of the NCAA ban. So yeah, I mean, I would hope it's possible. I don't know student athletes though that have organized.
I was just Googling it and found this disappointing statement from NCAA. It looks like it's like on the table, people are talking about it, but I don't know if anybody's won a union.
This is so predictable. Goddamn.
Participation in college sports is voluntary. They don't need tuition.
I mean, it undermines the purpose of college and education. I'm surprised UNM has not argued this about us, like considering graduate workers, employees would undermine the purpose of college for us, our education.
Sort of did. They were like, you guys are not public employees. Our relationship is strictly educational, right? So I mean, it was there sort of.
So I have a question, is can you talk about the different types of unions, democratic versus business, and if there are others, pros and cons of different structures?
I can start, but I'd like to hear from others too. Yeah, I mean, I think what's most useful to talk about is difference between So yeah, I mean, like, I think when you're talking about business unions, Aaron, you're pointing to a particular kind of unionism that's based on this model of kind of just, right, like, yeah, you're talking to a kind of unionism that's runs unions like a business, right? It's about this, like, you know, I pay dues, I get something in return, right? I get a higher paycheck, right? And it's a kind of unionism that doesn't challenge capital, right? It doesn't challenge the accumulation of capital. It's as, you know, like, I mean, UAW, and to bring some more UE history. By the way, yeah, I just read this book, and that's why I'm kind of stuck on this right now. It's a long, deep grudge. It's on the history of the FE, which was that small militant left union affiliated with UE. And UAW was raiding the FE throughout the entire 40s and 50s. You know, and they argued that at the time unions they're not fighting for a bigger slice of the pie. They're fighting for a bigger pie, right? So it's they were advocating for an increase in production and an increase in capital accumulation so that workers could get paid higher wages, right? It wasn't doing anything about the kind of ratio of power between workers and bosses, right? Meanwhile, some unions like the FE and the UE throughout their own history, you know, argued, you know, they were fighting for a bigger slice of the pie, right? And for workers to control the whole pie. So I don't know. I think that's a useful metaphor for thinking through that question. And I mean, the other thing you bring up there is business unions are top down, right? Democratic unions are about rank and file involvement, making sure, yeah, members are involved and leading the process. That's just a little bit there. But that's a big question that, yeah, we can talk about it for a while.
Well, I actually think this might have been brought up in the Salt of Their School, the class 1, but I'm not sure. But I also think and I'm not an expert on unions, but if you have a more democratic union, there's more room for what Axel talked about, like broader political aims. And you can kind of see that because sometimes when there's unions that are in like, less democratic unions that have more top-down structure, there's not as much chance for them to sign on to like solidarity statements or like do solidarity actions with other workers, even if they're in like the same, like maybe if they're in the same coalition or something like that. Yeah, so I think that's what makes UE able to do like this. And UE, like a big part of it is independent political action. Like that's one of the things that UE says makes it strong. And that means like independent of political parties, like Democrats or Republicans, and also independent of any other type of structure. But so what I'm trying to say is like we can make our own claims and arguments and demands, and we don't have to get tied up in like bureaucracy or like top down kind of structure. But of course UE works with any organization and wants to work with organizations or works with political parties when it's like advantageous, but just this idea of like independent labor power.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because it seems like sometimes that certain like political actions would be determined strategically in other sense as well, like how will this hurt or help our wage negotiations, right? But if our independent actions can be independent of those considerations too, it's a broader base. Yeah.
I'm wondering, Joe, if you could speak to, along the same line of reasoning, what are the other graduate unions like in terms of their structure? Are they similar to ours? Are they more along the lines of what UA is on campus, the faculty union? What's that like? Do you know?
So what are you talking about in terms of structure with respect to the faculty union?
Right. So in terms of like how democratic they are,
Oh, okay.
all of that.
Right. So I'm thinking right now about the UC system, they're all organized, the University of California system, they're all organized under the United Auto Workers. And I know that they've had problems, those grad workers have had problems with UAW. I'm thinking about, I haven't read about this in a while, so I might not be getting the details right, but the UC Santa Cruz strike in 2019 and 2020 was in response to UAW not securing an adequate cost of living wage in their negotiations with the university. Is that correct? Is that what happened? That's what I remember it being. Yeah. And so they declared a wildcat strike, and they struck against both the university and against like UAW's endorsement. And these workers, many of these workers ended up getting dismissed from their positions because they didn't have that full backing from UAW. And so that is a pitfall of some of these not less democratically or non-democratically run unions. I don't necessarily have other specific examples per se, but I think that example in particular speaks to the importance of kind of doing your research when looking at the kind of union you want to be want to charter under.
Yeah, and I definitely think you guys are building like a platform and an ability to build an example of how a graduate worker union should be run, right? And then from that position, being able to hold other graduate worker unions to account and say, hey, you have to prioritize the needs of your workers, you have to give them, it's their voice, not yours. I think there's a lot of room for you guys to support rank and file activists in those unions,
Thank you.
All right, well, I think this was a great class. I learned a lot. I'm an undergrad student at UNM, and so is James. So this was really cool. I remember when we saw classes on campus, I saw the faculty unionizing, and I was really excited. There was like that nice old man that gave out those spicy chocolate cookies all the time outside of Ortega, I think. And that was like the first time I even realized that there could be unions on campus. I never even thought of like the faculty being able to unionize or anything. And then I found out that the grad students wanted to unionize, and I didn't know that students could unionize. So, I mean, there was a lot of discussion on like, our undergraduates learning about it? They definitely are. It's like, I feel like it's opening a lot of windows and doors, just like different types of unions and how the power of unions can even come about. So it was cool to learn like a class on the background of it. So thank you guys.
That's great to hear, Lucy.
Yeah, thank you. That's awesome. And thank you for having us. I also learned, so this was great. Thank you.
And then a comment from David says, I taught labor history for a long time. This is really exciting. The union makes us strong. I think that's a good note to leave our class off on. So thank you guys so much for coming and doing that. And good luck with the union. I think we'll all be following along closely.
Thanks.
Thank you for your solidarity.